Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for the briefing. I have two questions. One is about the Fed, and one is about the IMF or corruption. The Fed, as I'm sure you know, didn't most recently raise rates, but people have noticed a change in their language of the press release that they put out, essentially saying, like, they had said in their previous one that, quote, global economic and financial developments continue to pose risks, and now their statement dropped that and just said that they continue to monitor it. So people interpret that to mean that the Fed, I guess what I wanted to ask you is, you seem to predict various things, if this, then that. If the Fed were to raise rates in June, what would be the impact on your various projections? And do you think that the Fed is, to what degree should they take into account the impact of their decisions on, countries beyond the United States? And on IMF corruption, maybe this is for Mr. Monchel, is that, if you want, yesterday Christine Lagarde put out an essay on corruption, and she started estimating the costs of corruption, bribery, et cetera, at $2 trillion. She said it's about a $2 trillion industry. So I'm wondering, she talked about the Panama Papers. What does the UN think, in light of the Panama Papers, that the drag of global corruption is? And do you think meetings like today's meeting in London and others could, in fact, boost growth if corruption were cracked down on? Thanks.
On the Fed, what happens if the Fed decides to raise interest rates in June? First of all, I would say that we don't think that is the most likely outcome. Our assessment is that the Fed will make one more quarter point rise in interest rates this year, but probably not till the latter part of the year. If they did, it would be a surprise to the market. Markets don't tend to like surprises, so there tends to be a lot of financial market volatility. So we would expect to see some jumps in financial markets in the short term. We would expect the US dollar to strengthen. And if you've monitored the US dollar and commodity prices recently, they've followed a very interestingly inverse relationship. Whereas as the dollar depreciates, commodity prices have started to come up. So I would expect to see those reverse as well, which as we highlighted in the report, a further deterioration in commodity prices could pose risks for many developing countries, particularly the commodity exporters. On corruption?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Is it that I know more about it or what? Well, I definitely agree with you. There is no question. The less corruption in the world, the more resources available for the different purposes of development of the nations of the world. There's no questions about it. This is not new. Corruption hampers poverty alleviation efforts. Corruption diverts resources that are supposed to be allocated, used, invested in education of children, in health of women and girls, on climate adaptation. So there is no other way of saying this. Any possible effort to curb corruption, to minimize the derailment of resources from development to private hands is certainly something that we all must celebrate. All these efforts are valid. Not only valid, but very much needed, and they need to be intensified. Of course, with the recent situation created by the announcement of the large amount of information that we know today as the Panama Papers, people have become more aware of the type of schemes, the type of things that different people around the world do, making use of existing laws, by the way. And so one of the challenges in today's world is making sure that government, leaders of the world, take a strong stand in making sure that national laws, as much as international agreements, address the possibility of using tax havens around the world. By the way, we also have been hearing lately that tax havens per se are not illegal, and that many individuals and companies around the world are making use of them, making use of existing legal framework. I think while acknowledging that that is a valid element, the challenge to date is to acknowledge that tax avoidance, illegal flows of resources to all these spaces are definitely one very important source of inequality. And so the UN is committed to minimize, to reduce, to eliminate inequality. We have a target that was set last year in ensuring that this will be an area of great progress by 2030. That was an agreement in the Agenda 2030. And so the UN is not working on anti-corruption, on integrity, and on transparency because the Panama Papers came into light. We are working on this for many decades already, supporting the establishment, the development of agreements in different regional settings, providing capacity development initiative to many countries around the world, and certainly the impetus that was provided last year during the deliberations in Addis Ababa that ended up with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda that put particular attention to the question of improving tax administration in developing countries, and where we saw many member states encouraging developed nations to address the issue of tax havens, doesn't give us anything else that more force, strength, and courage to continue this work. Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Matt.
Chairman, if you have a question.